We have a packed show today. We are joined by New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, Massachusetts Representative Ayanna Pressley, Oregon Representative Earl Blumenauer, Baltimore City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby, and the Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance, Cassandra Frederick. We're discussing the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. This legislation is currently in Congress, and it would remove marijuana from the list of controlled substances and eliminate associated criminal penalties while creating a process to expunge records of marijuana-related offenses. The bill would also tax sales of marijuana to create a fund for communities impacted by its criminalization. The MORE Act is being voted on later this month. Now, despite 2/3 of voters supporting legalization, the Trump administration reversed the Obama-era guidelines relaxing federal enforcement of marijuana restrictions. This came even though evidence shows legalization could address racial disparities in marijuana arrests, reduce opioid overdose deaths, and provide states with new multi-billion-dollar revenue streams, including to impacted communities. More and more states across the country are decriminalizing or legalizing recreational marijuana. In fact, there are 11 states where marijuana is fully legalized, compared to just 8 states where it is fully criminalized. As Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf recently said, while pushing for legalization, this revenue is critical in light of pandemic-caused budget shortfalls. Now, our guest legislation would settle a key part of this debate. By removing marijuana from the list of controlled substances and allowing states to legalize marijuana without fear of federal intervention, while also trying to mitigate some of the harm caused by its criminalization. So let's jump into our discussion, and turning first to Senator Booker. Senator Booker, thank you for being with us today. Now, you've talked about how the MORE Act has incorporated some of the work from your Marijuana Justice Act, which would decriminalize and make marijuana legal at the federal level. Can you provide us with just some context, really, by telling us why this is so important, what your bill would do, and what ways does marijuana decriminalization with investment in impacted communities and expungement address the needs of this national moment? So really, can you break this all down for us?
Yeah, look, this is a real tragedy. We have seen this war on drugs be a war on people, and particularly Black and brown people and low-income people. ACLU did a study of marijuana arrests in the United States between 2010 and 2018. And remember, 2017, there were more marijuana arrests than all violent crime arrests combined, and about 90% of them were for possession alone. The study also found that Black folks are about 3.64 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than their white peers, even though there's no difference in marijuana usage or even selling. In every single state in America, Blacks are dramatically more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. And so this to me is an outrage. As a person who lives in a Black and brown community, was a mayor of a majority Black city, you see the devastating impact of these arrests on African American communities, and how this war on drugs targeted to those certain communities has really done tremendous economic damage and more. And so it's not enough to say we want to legalize marijuana and decriminalize marijuana. I introduced the Marijuana Justice Act because I wanted to move forward and talk about restorative justice. And back in 2017, I was met with a lot of skepticism around the restorative justice provisions and the decriminalization provisions in the act. It has everything from expungement to reinvesting tax revenue into communities. But I'm really excited that these ideas of restorative justice have really gained more and more traction. And now the House of Representatives, which has in their MORE Act, which has a lot of components of my Marijuana Justice Act in it, as well as some of the other bills I've been pushing on the Senate side, like not having arrest for marijuana be something that people are getting deported over. I am just really excited about this historic vote that's about to happen on the MORE Act, and really looking forward to seeing and hearing about the House's momentum that I think can carry us into a Congress if we should take back control of the Senate in this election, where we could have groundbreaking marijuana justice, where we can create restorative justice, reinvestment in our communities, more fairness and equity, where marijuana legalization is not just an opportunity for a few people in the majority to get very rich, but really about restoring and repairing our communities and the lives that have really been destroyed by the war on drugs.
Thank you, Senator. And just speaking about movement in the House, I'd like to move to Representative Earl Blumenauer. Representative Blumenauer, in a recent interview with Joe Biden and Senator Kamala Harris, Senator Harris said that a Biden administration would pursue decriminalization of marijuana, though previously Biden only promised to, quote, deschedule and reschedule, which was considered a significant blow to marijuana legalization efforts. Last month, you said that you thought that Biden's plan to pursue decriminalization alone was meaningless, but that his campaign was evolving on the issue. How has Joe Biden evolved on this issue? Can you explain that for us? And do you believe that a Biden administration would sign the MORE Act?
Absolutely, I do. Remember that Vice President Biden was part of the Obama administration, which was faced with the wave of legalization of adult use in Colorado, Washington, my home state of Oregon. They responded very measured. They had the Cole memo that provided guidance so that states could be able to deal with their legalization. And we've also seen, I think, his selection of Senator Harris, who is our co-sponsor, lead co-sponsor in the Senate of the companion bill for the MORE Act. He has, I think, been clear about reflecting on some of the things in the past that he was involved with, that he's adjusted his thinking in terms of criminal justice. This is something that is driven across the board, not so much by politicians, but it has been driven by advocates and voters. I've been involved with this issue longer than any politician in America. I was part of the effort in Oregon that was the first state in the 70s to decriminalize. And I've been working on these campaigns across the country. I could not be more excited by watching the evolution that's taking place. And I'm absolutely convinced that a Biden administration would continue that movement forward. This is almost a settled issue. We now have 47 states with some form of cannabis that is state legal. You mentioned 11 states where it's entirely legal. We have states that are voting on it this fall. This is the side of history. We have overwhelming support in the House of Representatives. It's been demonstrated. We've had protections that have been put in appropriation riders since 2014. And with the leadership of people like my friend Senator Booker, I'm quite confident that we'll be able to work with the Biden administration, passage of the MORE Act. You saw what happened with the Safe Banking Act, 321 votes in the House, bipartisan. This is an issue whose time it's come, and I think the Biden administration will help us get there.
Thank you, Representative. And really speaking of the momentum and times changing, I want to bring Senator Booker back into our conversation and pose a question to you both. Now, a new report from the Justice Collaborative Institute with Data for Progress, Fair and Just Prosecution, and the Law Enforcement Action Institute shows that 6 out of 10 voters support full federal legalization, of marijuana. Basically what Representative Blumenauer was speaking about, the tides changing. Now, the MORE Act would leave it to states to determine whether marijuana is criminal and ensure any revenues generated from legalization would benefit impacted communities. Several states continue to punish people who use marijuana. Now, how many years do you both think it will be until marijuana is fully legal in the United States? And what are the barriers? And Senator.
Yes, I hope you can hear me, Summer. You blanked out in there, but if you
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
okay, good. Look, I was very aware of this fact, number one, that we have a lot of states that have discriminatory practices in their marijuana enforcement, as I said, all 50 states. And so my Marijuana Justice Act, understanding that, provided carrot and a stick, that if you have proven discriminatory practice in your enforcement of your marijuana laws, if you're not legalizing, but you're discriminatorily enforcing marijuana laws, then the federal government would be required to take action. That was the stick to move folks, and it would give incentives to people who are legalizing as well. I really do believe, I agree, Summer, with the spirit behind your question, that it's not enough to leave it just to the states if they are doing discriminatory things. The federal government has a role to play, and so these are some of the components of the Marijuana Justice Act, and hopefully the MORE Act and the efforts going on in the House right now that will help us to get to a point where we have true marijuana justice in our country.
Thank you, Senator Booker. And Representative Blumenauer, what are your thoughts on this? Lose the representative, or do you need to unmute?
Okay. I totally agree with what Corey said. I think the movement is very strong. I think once we get the MORE Act passed, it's going to be akin to what happened in the United States in 1933 when we repealed prohibition. Now, every state didn't automatically fully legalize and open up, but they moved very, very quickly. That's where the American public is. And what we have seen is that the progress has been driven not by politicians, but by voters. And I think that the tide here is very strong. And when we deal with the elements that Senator Booker mentioned, we've incorporated much of the marijuana justice that Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who's been a champion here, we're going to be able to use this as part of our racial justice initiative. And in fact, I am aware of that statistic, the 3.64%, or 3.64 times more likely for Black Americans. But if you look at young Black Americans, that's probably on an order of 10 times more likely. This is something we have to do to deal with the racial disparities in our criminal justice system. And I think people understand it. I think the movement on the part of the public is stronger. And then something, Summer, you mentioned at the top of the hour in terms of the revenues. There are people who are looking at this at a time when they're desperate for money to be able to help education and health and restore communities. This is a multi-billion-dollar opportunity to help restore not just the communities that have been damaged, but help other elements of damaged state and local revenues. I think it'll happen very, very quickly.
Thank you, Representative Blumenauer. And then turning back next to you, Senator Booker. I know that you have to leave us, but I would just love to know if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience about why the MORE Act is so important at this time.
Well, I want to thank you, Summer, for the question. I want, obviously, Congressman Blumenauer and the other leaders. Ayanna Pressley, I know, is going to be on this as well. There is an anguish in our country. It's what Michelle Alexander wrote about, calling the new Jim Crow. And marijuana enforcement has been one of the most significant ways, as Congressman Blumenauer is saying, to continue the whole-scale subjugation of certain communities. I watched people use marijuana without any concerns at places like Stanford and Yale, where I went to school, because they know there's different laws apply to them differently. But in low-income communities where we see, again, as I said, more marijuana arrests than all violent crime arrests combined in 2017, you see the level of this crisis that we have. And remember, there are 40,000 collateral consequences, according to the American Bar Association, for people that have a criminal record. And so a felony charge for possession of marijuana for doing things that two of the last three presidents admitted to doing, that Congress people are admitting to doing. We're seeing so many young people having their lives destroyed, their economic potential severely hindered, their well-being affronted. And that has created widespread poverty. I think it was Villanova University that showed that if we had similar arrest rates as other industrial nations, we would have about 20% less poverty in America. And so the last thing I really want to just tell everybody is it's great to see this moving forward in the House, and the leadership over there is extraordinary. But this doesn't amount to change. It amounts to showing greater potential and promise for change if this next election people actually vote. And I'm really getting frustrated with hearing folk sometimes say, I'm not sure if it makes a difference if I vote or not. Dear God, look at what, since 2018, the House of Representatives, the bills that they've been passing around racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, voting rights. Those bills are being stopped here in the Senate, and the Senate will flip if we all get out there and vote. And the presidency, it is a big difference. I know some people might have concerns about Joe Biden or marijuana, but please, the guy is, as Blumenauer's comments were, when you deschedule marijuana on the federal level, you allow states to make a lot more progress. But right now, we don't see that happening. So the legislation I think that we're working on in the House and the Senate, I believe that Joe Biden will sign if we can get it passed. So that's the final urgency right now. Change doesn't come from Washington, it comes to Washington. If you want to see change around this issue, then please get out there and vote, not just for the presidency, you got to vote the whole ticket down, because there's so many Senate races that are in the balance, and especially the African-American vote in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, in Minnesota. These are difference-making voting populations if we get out there and vote. So thank you, Summer.
Thank you so much, Senator Booker, and thank you for being with us today. Now, going off of what Senator Booker was talking about in reference to change and a focus on change in the criminal justice system, I'd like to turn to State Attorney Mosby. Now, State Attorney Mosby, you've said that your office will not prosecute marijuana possession. How does criminalization of marijuana impact mass incarceration? And what would this kind of federal legislation do for your local fight to reform the justice system? And State Attorney Mosby, you may need to unmute as well.
Okay, here we go. In this moment, right, where time and time again, Black people in this country are losing their lives as a result of unnecessary police engagement for the most minor, mundane, and trivial offenses, like passing an alleged counterfeit $20 bill during a global pandemic for groceries, or selling a loose cigarette, right? Or God forbid, you fail to put on a turn signal. Justice requires a re-examination of the failed policies of the past. War on drugs, which has been admittedly a war on Black people in this country. So in 2019, my office completed a study of marijuana enforcement in the city of Baltimore. And as was eloquently already articulated by Senator Cory Booker, right, the arrest rate and the use rate for marijuana, the use rate is the same, but the arrest rate is disproportionately impacting Black people. Nationally, you're 4 times more likely to be arrested, but in the city of Baltimore, you were 6 times more likely to be arrested for mere possession of marijuana. And what we discovered was that there was absolutely no public safety value to the prosecution of marijuana. If anything, it was creating unnecessary engagement that was creating a level of distrust among the community that we needed when it comes to community and law enforcement. It was disproportionately being impacted by communities of color, and it was counterproductive to the limited resources that we were utilizing in law enforcement. You know, you look at a city like Baltimore, where in 2018, we had a 26% clearance rate, right? Year-end clearance rate. We were solving 1 out of 4 murders every single year. Let's reallocate those resources and use those for something that we can really focus on violent crime and that's going to really make our communities safer. And so the most problematic issue for me after the decriminalization of 10 grams or less in the state of Maryland, what we were still finding was that they were still focusing on poor Black and brown communities. This year after the decriminalization, 89% of the citations that the police department was issuing were issued to Black people. The following year, 94% was issued to Black people. The following year, 95% were issued to Black people. And what was even more disturbing was that 42% of all of the citations that were being issued in the city of Baltimore went to 1 out of 9 police districts, which was disproportionately impoverished and 95% Black. So what I said was that as a prosecutor, I need to utilize my discretion and not be complicit in discriminatory enforcement against of laws against poor Black and brown people. And so I have one of the most progressive marijuana policies in the state, in the entire country. We do not prosecute marijuana regardless of the amount and regardless of criminal history. And so what we've also been able to see as a result of our policy is that it has not had a disparate sort of impact on public safety, right? We've been able to reallocate resources so that we're not diverting a number of our time, our attention on low-level possession cases, and we were able to redirect resources towards our homicide unit and have additional prosecutors in our general felony unit and our misdemeanor unit. And so that is what I've attempted to communicate to not just, other prosecutors in this country, but understanding and recognizing the importance of that discretion when it comes to prosecutorial discretion in this country.
Thank you, State Attorney Mosby. And your statistics, the way you were able to break it down, really paint a picture of what is happening on the ground, which I think often is lost when people are going through their day-to-days and especially dealing with the pandemic. So thank you so much for grounding us and having us really understand what you're trying to address on a daily basis. Now, trying to open up this conversation to include the community, I'd love to shift to Cassandra Frederick. Cassandra, you run a major organization working to reform substance use laws across the country. Mm-hmm. Now, how does this bill help your efforts? And what more needs to be done? Really, how, I guess, kind of going off of what State Attorney Mosby was saying in reference to shifting resources, mm-hmm. How would a public health and community-based approach to recreational substance use differ from the current criminalization model?
Thank you so much, Summer, and thank you to everyone for inviting Drug Policy Alliance to join us today. So, as you mentioned, I work at Drug Policy Alliance. We're a national organization working to shift our responses to drug possession and drug use in this country. We recognize that the way that we have set up our laws around drug use don't do anything around public safety, and they don't do anything around public health. And one of the biggest things that we have worked on is marijuana reform. And we see this as an important drug for us to build conversation about because it is one of the drugs that is most used. Most people have some sort of experience with it. But I think what's really important to know is that the harms that Prosecutor Mosby just laid out are harms associated with all drugs. Drugs in general are used as a way to criminalize and target certain groups of people. And when we're having the conversation of the public health impacts of marijuana prohibition, we have to be clear that it is not just happening in our jails and prisons. Marijuana is one of the biggest ways that people get technical violations and they get re-incarcerated. Marijuana is one of the reasons why people lose custody of their kids. Marijuana is one of the reasons why people lose the ability to be in public housing. It is one of the number one reasons why people are deported or put into detention. And so when we're having a conversation about marijuana reform and why it's so crucial for us to be having this conversation at the federal level is that we must understand the ways that marijuana prohibition have shaped and destabilize communities. It's why the conversation about reinvestment is so crucial because the damage has been so extensive. And so as we're having the conversation at the federal level, I think it's really important for us to recognize that marijuana prohibition is not only a feeder into mass incarceration, but it's a feeder into mass surveillance, mass punishment, and the criminalization of people. The fact that we are in the middle of a public health crisis around COVID-19, and we know it's going to lead to vast economic depressions and unemployment. The fact that people can't get a job at Walmart because they will not be able to pass a drug test to be able to fold t-shirts is a problem and leads to the destabilization and the poverty in our communities. So as we have conversations about marijuana legalization, the public health impacts of structural inequities, social determinants of health have to inform the ways that we move forward. Because if we're going to have a conversation around reproductive justice, around housing stability, we're going to have a conversation about food security, we're going to have a conversation about climate justice, the ways that we grow and build and cultivate marijuana impacts our climate. And so the conversation at the federal level has to be as intersectional and as comprehensive as the destruction that has been wrought by marijuana prohibition.
Thank you, Cassandra. And just talking about destruction and the effect of marijuana prohibition, I'd love to turn now to Representative Presley, because one of the tenets of the MORE Act is the reinvestment in impacted communities. So Representative Presley, thank you for being with us today. We know that you only have a bit of time, but we'd love for you to really talk to us about what you envision the funding mechanism for impacted communities, what that will do, how that will be helpful.
Sure. So first, I just want to just say what an honor it is to be in virtual community with many of these folks who I consider to be my chosen family in the work of social justice. I wish we could all physically be together, but I'm glad I have a couple of minutes in between votes to join you in virtual community today. And I know I'm amongst family and I'm preaching to the choir, but it bears repeating. We know for too long that the war on drugs has criminalized addiction and substance use disorders in a way that has devastated our communities. The thing is, this harm was not naturally occurring. These were policy choices. So for decades, these policies were designed to cause systemic hurt and harm for Black and Brown communities. And for generations, we have had a first row seat to the firsthand grave consequences of this. So now we must be as precise in legislating healing and justice as those policies were in inflicting hurt and harm for generations. So we find ourselves at this national reckoning on racial injustice, and community builders and organizers and thought leaders and policymakers, like all of you, are demanding this dismantling of these racist systems and unjust policies that have led to the divestment and over-policing of Black communities. And while this may be a new moment, an epiphany for many, for organizers and thought leaders like all of you, you've been doing this work in community for a long time. The cause to finally invest in our communities, to finally value Black lives are not new. We have known that a return to normal is not acceptable because the pre-COVID normal was one that was insufficient, unjust, and inadequate to begin with. And we have witnessed these injustices every day for generations. Our communities are over-policed, criminalized, our loved ones are imprisoned, and our families are separated. And this is personal for me. I'm not alone in that. That's how we know it's systemic, because I'm no anomaly. Like thousands of children in America, I grew up with an incarcerated parent who cycled in and out of the criminal legal system for some 14 years. And, we failed my father. He was failed by the war on drugs. My father was failed by our public health system. My father was struggling with trauma and addiction, and that should have been treated as a medical issue, not criminalized. So we need justice and healing. We need policies like the MORE Act that will address the long-standing mass incarceration crisis, expunge prior federal cannabis convictions, and incentivize states to go through similar processes. But it doesn't stop there. Now, a critical piece of this legislation is that it will reinvest in our Black and Brown communities that for too long have been locked up disproportionately and now are being locked out of a multi-billion-dollar industry. And this is true in many states, including my home state of Massachusetts, that have made it medically or recreationally legal. So with critical funds set aside to support communities that bear a disproportionate impact from the failed war on drugs, it makes investments in supporting reentry, job training programs, and providing resources and support for families like my own. And the time is now. The time for incremental reforms that's been over. We need policies at every level of government that declare that Black lives matter, and we must finally put an end to the systems that these policies which uphold racism in our country. Look, we're grateful for your solidarity and your allyship and hashtags and likes and retweets, but the only receipts that matter right now are budgets and policies. And that's why we need the Marijuana Justice Act, the Fair Chance Act, and the Safe Banking Act.
Thank you, Representative Presley. And I mean, I don't know if anyone could have said it better. The time is now for real change. And like you said, this issue being personal to you, I think what we've all learned throughout this pandemic is issues that might seem remote and focused on some will become personal and will affect us all. So the time is now. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Now,
Nice to meet you. I'm such an admirer.
Oh,
Marilyn,
God.
love you, Earl. Good to be with you.
Always good to see you. Always good to see you, sis.
Oh my God, such a girl crush.
all right. Thank you again, Representative Presley. So turning to our last few questions, and these questions I would just love to pose to all of our remaining panelists. So first, we've been talking about the upcoming House vote on the MORE Act. Now, how have conversations with elected officials about marijuana legalization evolved over the past few years? And how have the crises of our moment, from the pandemic to ongoing police killings, impacted your perspectives on marijuana reform? And if we can start with you, Representative Blumenauer. You might have to unmute again.
Sure. Well, it's been really remarkable watching the evolution of this issue. When we started the Cannabis Caucus 6 years ago, it was hard to get bipartisan support. People ran away from the issue. And what we have seen over the course of the last 6 or 7 years, people understand the force of what Congresswoman Presley said. They watch how it manifests itself with especially Black Americans, but other people of color, that it doesn't get them anywhere. And they have watched voters take these steps. And slowly but surely, people are more resolute. The fact that now over 2/3 of the American public supports full legalization, over half Republicans. People are getting their footing. And the advocates have been making the case so forcefully. What's happened with veterans who talk about what medical marijuana has done to save their lives. It's been a very powerful wave that's been building. At the beginning of this Congress, I published a blueprint for how all the various committees could do something. And what we have found already in this Congress, we have seen the Safe Banking Act pass overwhelmingly. My marijuana research bill just passed a week ago on its way to the floor. We've watched members when they were on a bipartisan basis move the MORE Act through the Judiciary Committee. The momentum is building. More people understand. And members of Congress who take a bolder stand are rewarded. Nobody's losing an election over this. There's blowback if they aren't being heard. And the last chapter, and you've talked about this in terms of what's happened to young Black men, probably 1 million or more, having their lives destroyed by Richard Nixon's deliberate targeting of Black Americans and young Americans for political purposes. The dawn has settled, and I think the momentum is swelled. I think we're going to see not just a strong vote in the House, but I think there's a chance that this is going to move through the Senate with the leadership of Senator Booker, but this realization that is building.
Thank you, Representative. And State Attorney Mosby, what are your thoughts on this? Especially, I'm interested to know how you've seen this conversation change in reference to your decision to decriminalize marijuana and resistance that you have felt in your state.
So the one thing I just need to acknowledge is Congressman Blumenauer, you have been an advocate for so long, and I appreciate your service, your sacrifice, and your advocacy. The one thing I will say is that while there's a healthy sort of debate right now about police reform in this country and prosecutors, me being the top prosecutor in the city of Baltimore, obviously we have a role in terms of prosecuting police misconduct, but we also have a role in deciding how we're going to use our discretion. We know that often Black people are stopped, and we've heard the statistics, by police for drug possession or similar minor offenses that have no public safety value. We've talked about that. These interactions can turn deadly for Black people in this country. And if you look at Eric Garner, if you look at George Floyd, they were stopped over something so trivial, yet the offenses became a death sentence for them because they were Black. And so, we have to be devised and intended. When we look at the intent of the war on drugs, which was supposed to be policies geared towards Black people, we have to be just as intentional in rectifying that war on drugs. And so from a public health perspective, we should be taking this out of the hands of law enforcement. And so one of the things that I've been advocating from a prosecutorial perspective is that we cannot wait for the wheels of the federal government. And I'm optimistic that we're going to get bipartisan support on the MORE Act, which is critical to the advancement of our country in so many ways in this moment. But prosecutors should be using their discretion to stop enforcing marijuana laws if they don't, and the communities that have elected them, right? They have power as well. Understand and recognize that there's no public safety value. It's counterproductive to the limited resources that we have. And that at the end of the day, it's being discriminatorily enforced. And so there's always been prosecutorial discretion in the criminal justice system. It's just that it's usually made by white males used to pursue a harsher or tougher sentence, right? But when the discretion is used to reform the criminal justice system, when you hear those types of complaints as a Black woman who has been keen to understanding that sort of negative impact, you heard from Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, right? The negative impact of mass incarceration and the drug war on our communities. Voters have elected us to bring that perspective to the job. And what I'll continue to do, understanding what we're facing, is that we have to reduce those racial disparities in the criminal justice system in a manner consistent with public safety, because the voters of each and every one of our cities have elected us to do so. And it starts here.
Thank you,
That
State
is
Attorney.
so powerful. If I could,
thank you, State Attorney Mosby. Did you
I
have
just-
something to add, Representative?
I was just going to say, I could not agree with her more. And they're initiating a revolution on the ground. So with progressive prosecutors who understand that reality. Although I've often wondered what would happen if the prosecutorial discretion had been trained at young white offenders. It would probably have ended this in a matter of weeks if they'd been subjected to that same sort of treatment.
But you know what,
We likely-
Congressman, one thing I will say is that we're looking at it from a different perspective. For far too long, we've criminalized substance use disorder and addiction in this country because we have stigmatized it to associate it with Black people. And now that it has gone through not just gone past the confines of inner city America, right? It's touching the suburbs and quite candidly, white people in this country, we're now looking at it as a public health crisis, which we should have been doing from the outset of this crisis.
Yep.
Thank you both. Now, turning next to Cassandra for your thoughts, really just to bring us home on this subject. Do you have anything to add to this question? And really, how you see the crises of this moment, the pandemic, police killings, how is that coming together to change people's perception of drug prosecution? And how do you think that could lead to an eventual end of this war on drugs?
So I think we are in this moment, and it's very clear. In October will be the 50th anniversary of the Controlled Substances Act passing. In June 2021, it will be the 50th year of President Richard Nixon's declaration of the war on drugs. What's clear to us is that the very issues that we're fighting on, the very things that we think is wrong around marijuana prohibition, are the same things that are wrong around all drug prohibition. We have multiple mental models that make us think certain ways about all drugs. And we are also not just in a COVID pandemic, we are still amidst an overdose pandemic, and overdose rates are rising. And yes, the perception is that we have white suburban folks dying, but the rates of overdose deaths among Black people and Latinx people are also rising. Folks are not talking about the overdose rate and the way that it's decimating Indigenous communities in this country. This moment around COVID is clear. We need to remove the ways that people are criminalized, especially people that are poor, especially people that are queer, especially people that are living, that are non-citizens. The war on drugs is a mechanism and a praxis to entangle groups of people and to kill them. The way that we have a situation where a young Black woman can be in her bed sleeping and be killed at the suspicion of being involved in the drug trade, please know that Breonna Taylor is not the first, and there have been many that have been killed in their homes in the tradition of the war on drugs. Philando Castile's attorneys, Philando Castile, the police officers that killed Philando Castile, they got off because that attorney used the defense of a marijuana odor as a reason for them to fear for their lives. It is by design that that same attorney is defending the officers that killed George Floyd and using the fact that fentanyl was in his system and saying that fentanyl is what killed him, as opposed to them having their knee on his neck for 9 minutes. If we are having a federal conversation about ending marijuana prohibition, then we need to have a federal conversation about dismantling the Controlled Substances Act, abolishing the DEA, removing all the regulatory policies that make the drug war destabilize our communities and impede us from getting to a place where our communities are healthy and safe. We can do something different when it comes to drugs. We can focus on health. And also with marijuana, we can also experiment with different scales of economies. It does not have to be an over-commercialized, over-capitalized system. We can try different things like worker co-ops. We have the opportunity to do something different. And this moment not only demands it, it requires it. And so as we move forward and have these conversations at the federal level about the MORE Act, let's also have conversations about the BREATHE Act that the Movement for Black Lives is pushing forward, which also includes a part about decriminalizing all drug possession. Let's have a conversation, as State Attorney Marilyn Mosby says, about making drugs a health issue and abolishing the DEA and putting it into the National Institute of Health. Let's actually have a conversation about all the money that we put into international wars in the name of the drug war. We can do better, and we must do better, because our society is at a moment where it is about transformation. And we cannot do that without removing the ways that we use policy as a way of doing white supremacy's work.
Mm. Thank you, Cassandra. I mean, what a way for us to end. And this mechanism of victimization of killing has to end, and the time for transformation is now. Thank you, Cassandra Federique. Thank you, State Attorney Mosby. Thank you, Representative Blumenauer. Thank you all for being with us today for this important and informed conversation. We will be live again in half an hour to talk about what is happening in Rochester, New York, since the police killing of Daniel Prude. And I mean, even just listening to Cassandra's words, we understand how all of this is connected, how the war on drugs is connected to these police killings, to what happened to Mr. Prude. So please, if you're able, tune into that show as well. Thank you all for joining the briefing. Follow Appeal News on Facebook and The Appeal on Twitter for the latest news. Again, I am Summer Lacey. Have a wonderful day. And again, just to echo what we've all heard,